Think about your favorite throw pillow, that cozy blanket that you wrap yourself in on chilly nights, or even the rug that ties your living room together. Every thread, every pattern, and every stitch is the result of many skilled hands working meticulously behind the scenes, packed with creativity and craftsmanship. Today, we are venturing into the vibrant world of textile design and learn about professionals who brighten our days. Welcome back to Career Calling, your ultimate guide to navigating the world of work, one profession at a time, to help you find your calling and turn it into a career. I'm your host, Pratibha Pandit. My guest today is Toni Lobsenz, a veteran textile designer whose expertise spans from home furnishings, apparel, woven textiles, quilts, and rugs. She has worked with some of the industry's most recognizable names: Williams Sonoma, Pottery, Esprit, World Market, Nautica, Mulberry, to name a few. In addition, Toni has also shaped the next generation of textile designers as an adjunct professor at California College of the Arts. In this episode, we will delve into the vibrant world of textile design and learn what it takes to build a career in this creative field. Hi, Toni. Welcome to Career Calling.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I have a lot of friends in San Francisco Bay Area who come from non-tech type of background, including textile. And then often the notion is there is no opportunity here. So today I'm really excited to have you here and learn a little bit about the textile design and the opportunity. I think it's very valuable for a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people are interested in it. And in addition to working in the field, I also taught at 2 art colleges in the textile department, in the fashion textile department and the interior design departments.
That's amazing. So let's get started from the very basics. Help our viewers understand what is textile design? What does the profession involve?
It involves a lot. It really depends on what branch of textile design you're working in, what your job will be. I've worked mainly in apparel and in home furnishings. So I worked for companies like Esprit as a head designer for many years. They used to be in San Francisco. They're not any longer. The company's, the American division is out of business. But what it involves is doing a lot of research. And by research, I mean paying attention to what trends are from big designers, big name designers, looking at the runway shows. I would go to trade shows in Europe and in Paris and in Germany and at those and New York. I went to New York quite a bit. At those trade shows, you interact with the manufacturers of the fabrics. And as the designer, I would go to various places in different countries, depending on what was their expertise. Like for India, they were wonderful with yarn dye plaids and jacquards and things like that. And cotton was the fabric that they were the best in. And also, I really appreciated working with the manufacturers, the vendors there, because they had such a wonderful sense of aesthetics, which in other countries was nowhere near to the quality of working there. So I really enjoyed that. I would go to China. I would go to Portugal quite a bit to work on fabrics. I went to China a lot and Hong Kong. But I have to say that my favorite place was India for the expertise. And I designed a lot of rugs. Pottery Barn had the division that I was working in. I worked in all divisions. I worked in children's clothing. I worked in menswear, not for Pottery Barn, but for other menswear companies, large menswear companies. I worked in a division, which I was the first designer hired to start this division, just subsequently become quite successful. It's called Pottery Barn Team. And so that was a completely different product than working for main Pottery Barn. So it really depended on what the product was. A textile designer needs to know a lot of technical things. What are the different weaves and what's the equipment that, what are the looms that are producing that and what are the limitations? And in doing prints, are certain parameters that you must design within because of the way that they're printed. If it's a screen print, when you do the repeat, which is there's a block of a design that's repeated continuously to create a continuous fabric, and it has to match up at both ends of the block.
Mhm.
So it's quite technical to get that to all fit, and you have to know what the equipment is that's
Mhm.
being used because there's all different sizes for the rollers or the screens, and you have to know that which is best in which country. And so sometimes when I worked for Esprit, I would print stuff in Japan because
Mm.
they were the incredible printers, and in Portugal they were wonderful weavers, and so it really would depend. I loved working on rugs. That's another thing a textile designer could do, but that's also extremely technical.
Mhm.
So I would go and work directly with the rug factories,
Mhm.
generally in India and also in China. And so the other part of being a textile designer is sourcing out new direction, paying attention to trends. And that involves going to the trade shows and trend shows. But it's important to also do a lot of shopping to see what the competition is doing because it's a product you're creating and you have competitors. So you need to see what's out there in the market and create your own niche, your own unique product because anybody can, it's in that industry of textile prints and wovens and general and screen prints. A lot of people copy, not people, but companies that don't have the integrity
Mhm.
to not copy somebody else's designs.
Mhm.
So at Pottery Barn, they have a whole legal department that does nothing but look for copyright infringement because
Got
there's
it.
a lot of them out.
Help me draw the difference between, let's say, a fashion designer who's designing apparel, right? They're designing the clothes that people wear. How is textile design different from it? Is it designing the fabric itself? Or tell me a little bit of a difference between what does the manufacturer do, like the ones that are weaving versus the textile designer and the ones that are creating any products out of it, like a apparel.
Oh, that's a good question. At Esprit, which was at the time was a very large manufacturer that worked out of many countries. And
Mhm.
what the difference was, or how the job was approached, is I worked directly. There was a head design director who had the overview of the children's division, the junior division, the more contemporary, more for an older woman versus a teenager.
Mhm.
And then there was a shoe division, an accessory division. There were all these different divisions. And so at the beginning of a season, I would work directly hand in hand with the design director. She and I would figure out the color palette for the season based on what was trending and what we thought was right.
Mhm.
And I would present concept boards. They're called presentation boards. I would present these boards that would have, I'd do maybe 6 to 10 of them per season to show concepts of things that we could execute to that would flow one into the other
Mhm.
so that the color palette could not be exactly the same for each of the collections, but there was a cohesive theme throughout.
Hmm.
So that, and we would study the color trends. There's a lot of color services that companies pay thousands of dollars for that they come and they give you all these like yarn balls or things that are their predictions. Like Dixie yarn is a big one in the United States that works entirely in cotton.
Hmm.
And they will sell you these services and you look through them. And so the companies that could afford it that I've worked for would buy like maybe 3 or 4 of those services. So
Hmm.
then the design director and I would get together and I would actually paint chips of different colors. If the color wasn't there that I thought was important, I would mix it and
Hmm.
paint big swatches. And I would present those big swatches on a board. I studied a lot of color theory and I also taught color theory at the art colleges. And so I think that's one area that's very important for anybody that wants to get involved in textile design is to know at least at minimum the basics of color theory, because you have to know what's going to happen when you're doing for example, a plaid. When you're weaving a plaid, you've got different colors. You've got a warp and a weft. You've got yarns going this way. You've got yarns going this way. And so they're going to cross each other. And if you don't know what's going to happen when those colors cross each other, you could get a terrible outcome. So you have to kind of figure it out. And now with that, and since the computer's been used a lot, I would do a lot of designing of those kind of textiles on the computer, because it was very easy to set a grid for whatever the yarn count was, and then to put in the weft and put in the warp and then combine them and see what the finished plaid would look like.
Is this a direction towards what kind of fabric that you should pick, like the what colored fabric?
No, because the fabrics would be dyed to order.
Okay.
For example, at Esprit again, they would create a lot of pants that were solid colors that would go with the pattern tops. So woven into the textiles or mixed in the print, there was always a bit of those solid colors used in patterning so that it would go back with the solid color pants, just as an example. So what happens is the color palette is decided, and from there, the textile development starts, and it's a long process. It takes a couple of months. I had a studio of anywhere from 6 to 10 artists working for me at different times under direction to create the patterns. Some people were really good. Some of the people who came into the studio were really good, and others were student level. So I would be art directing a lot, depending on who was working for me. So some of them were freelancers, some of them were on staff, but I was always working hand in hand with the design director. The textile designers also do like applique designs, embroidery designs, do embellishments. And every company is different. So for example, at Pottery Barn, which does mostly home furnishings, so not furniture, but quilts and sheets and kitchen towels and rugs and anything for the home that's a textile. And it's not just a cotton, it's like wool or rayon so that was the most fun thing, was doing rugs, because it was kind of like doing a sculpture of creating high pile, low pile, and using the colors of the season and creating patterns on the rug.
Coming back to the apparel, or like Spree, for example, once you do those colors or patterns, is textile designer also responsible for the style, like what kind of dresses are made from it, or that's not your department?
No, that's the design director,
Okay.
who has a series of garment designers, not necessarily people that do color or textile prints. They just do the sketches of the garments. And then they do what's called specs, which is specifications. They put in all the details. This cuff is 4 inches and this collar. They'll do the sketch and then they notate all that stuff. And there's a lot of that specification that goes on for the textiles too. So it takes a lot of time. And sometimes things are being sent out to maybe 3 or 4 different vendors, the same thing, the same design. Would go out for the textiles, would go out, and then they pick the one that did the best execution.
Oh, okay.
So they wouldn't produce a whole bunch of the textile. They did what's called strike-offs, which is a small piece of hand screen printed fabric for approval. So I would go to different countries while they were doing the strike-offs, the first printing of something, and correct colors or correct a bit of the pattern. So I did a lot of technical stuff too.
At this point, do you also decide the fabric? Like when you go out to the manufacturer, you have the pattern, the colors. At this time, do you also have a fabric in mind? Like what type of fabric it should be?
Do have a fabric in mind, but I spent a lot of time on my knees going to the factories, going through bins, looking for different constructions of fabrics, because I didn't want it all to be the same. So I was looking for novelty constructions, and I would bring them back to San Francisco. We'd have a meeting and I'd present them as concepts with, here's the artwork. This is the base fabric I'd like to use to do the printing on. And so, yeah, it doesn't just all happen at once. It's done in stages.
Okay.
But I do have a fabric in mind. The design director has a fabric in mind. But then above us, there's a whole nother network of people that have the right to approve or disapprove, like the VPs and well, if you've worked in a corporate environment, you know how that structure can be.
Yes.
So we would have
Yes.
things, and we also, because Pottery Barn had their own stores, so there was a whole other contingent of people that were called the merchants. Those were the buyers, basically, who would decide how much of each design they were going to buy, what colors, and I present like, I'd like to do this quilt and I want to do it in these 5 colors. And
they already have a prerequisite requirement for you when they come in.
No, because they haven't seen the designs yet to pick them apart.
Okay.
So they come in and they say, well, I love these colors, but I want a bright pink. And you don't have any bright pink. So I would know to myself, and I would advise as diplomatically as possible, that color is not going to work in this fabrication. And I think that this would be a better fit for this fabric. So that's where the expertise of the head textile designer comes in. And it's from years of experience. I have over 30 years of experience. So I learned by coming up through the ranks and doing a lot of traveling. So
yeah, very fascinating process. Now, you mentioned along the way a couple of different work settings like freelancing, or you worked at the different companies, and Pottery Barn we all know because of the stores. Let's talk a little bit about that. What are the different work settings textile designers can work in?
It depends on the end product that the company is producing. Textiles, can go across the gamut. So, but generally speaking, I would work in a studio, which would have a lot of junior designers or freelancers that would all be in there working. Some would be painting. Most of them are on the computer now. And I would have presented to them at the beginning of the season what the concept was. We had what we called the war room, which was a big room that had all these big cork boards on it. And I would pin up concepts for fabrics and what the color story was. Everybody got a color story, which was like a board with Pantone. Do you know what Pantone is? Pantone chips, color standards. So each one would have those color standards. And then usually a junior person would be responsible for mixing those colors on the computer. And then everyone would have the standardized colors to work with so that all the results off of all the computers would be the same when they were printed out in terms of color.
And this studio is the company studio or your own studio?
The big corporations have their own studios.
Okay.
I have my own studio, but I would work there. And there were studio sections based on the furniture group was over here. The home accessories were over here, tabletop, and the hard goods like the plates and the cups and the vases and all that stuff. They had their own section. And they had amazing resources to use in the studio especially for the bedding, because we had they're called plotter printers, the Epson plotter printers, which have probably at least 6 colors of toner that will mix. And the rolls are like 36 inches wide to 60 inches wide. It's rolls of paper that bend through there, white paper. And then it prints out. You send the designs in repeat. So it's doing what the printer would be doing. And it comes out in long sheets that you go to the presentation room, which has beds in it. And all the furniture, like the furniture department would set up their beds and their bookshelves, and the tabletop would set up a table with a table set with their proposed samples. And we would take these long rolls of paper. I think I have some, but these were from Pottery Barn for textile prints on this paper. And so we would make beds with this stuff.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So if this was a sheet, this would go down on the bed and look like a sheet on the bed. And then we wrap this around pillows for the pillowcases. And then we put a quilt on top of it. Actually, a 3-dimensional quilt. That's a first sample, but it would make everything look very realistic.
So these designs, like these flowers and all of that, is what you have designed for each season.
Yes. That's an idea of how it comes out.
Now, the companies that are hiring, give me a little bit of idea on what are the type of companies that hire textile designers.
Unfortunately, since the pandemic in San Francisco, there are very few companies left. The big companies all you were here for a long time. And the people that would hire textile designers would be Esprit, that's no longer here. Pottery Barn has 3 or 4 different divisions that they hire textile designers for. But they try to hire freelancers, qualified freelancers, as often as possible because it saves them a lot of money. Obviously, they don't have to pay benefits to the freelancers. So, but there's Levi Strauss and the other places that textile designers could work or get work are wallpaper companies. I've done a lot of wallpaper. So there's that. There's the greeting cards and wrapping paper, obviously. You can work for companies that produce kitchen goods, towels, kitchen towels, or placemats and that kind of thing. There's different divisions of textiles. Working in rugs is that's my favorite thing, but it's mostly done overseas. And it also, as I said before, is quite technical. So if they're a textile design and they're working 2-dimensionally and they're working on the computer and they have strong computer skills and artistic skills, then there's also the possibility of working in graphic design, and that could encompass books. But I already said greeting cards, but that's another form of graphic design. They could work in creating tabletop, 3-dimensional. If they have computer skills, like a couple of my friends who are textile designers that ran out of work because they were freelancers, started working for ceramic companies, home accessories companies, and designing all kinds of decorative items. So it's not textiles, but it's you can apply your skill to that. The other thing is once someone gets a lot of experience or knows what they're doing and has a skill to offer, is teaching. I was an adjunct professor at California College of the Arts and at the Academy of Art College. It's both in San Francisco. And they hired me because they were having a really hard time finding people that A, wanted to teach, and B, knew what they were doing in terms of teaching it.
Let's talk about a little bit about the education. So to be a textile designer, can any art discipline like fine arts or those type of visual arts discipline can become textile designer, or it requires a very specific education background?
I think it's a specialty. How I got introduced to textile design was through the art department when I went to college. And I had already been doing a lot of, I didn't know it was textile design, but I was always an artist from the time I was a child. And I loved to embroider and I loved to paint and I loved to do things like that. So I think that's how I decided. And I loved fashion and I made my own clothes quite often because I couldn't find in the stores what I wanted to wear then. So I think it's not necessary to have a degree. It's really not. There are people that have master's degrees, but it's really not necessary. I have never, in all my years and all the companies I've worked for, ever had anyone ask me what degree do I have.
Oh, interesting.
I have a BA in art and textile design. I have it. Textile design was my major and art history was my minor. And that's another thing. I think that if a person wants to go into textile design, they need to have an awareness of other cultures and art history. For example, like for rugs, Turkey and Morocco and places like that, or even Mexico. I went to Mexico on a personal trip to go to these rug weavers outside of Oaxaca that used all natural dyes. So they showed me all the plants that they used and where they got them from. And they had an incredible array of colors using all natural dyes. And they did these beautiful flat woven rugs, not hooked rugs. In India, they mostly do hooked rugs, other than the kielams, which is flat woven. But I think it's important that if a person wants to go into textile design, that they have a good sense of color, because the color becomes so important. The color's the foundation. And it's important to know how to execute the designs based on where it's going to be produced and what they're offering in terms of production, because the production's the other end of it that becomes very important.
And what about the textile itself, like the fabric, knowledge of fabric itself? Is that something that is taught in college? Can somebody who has other forms of art background, can they pick up easily about fabric and those type of things?
It depends on the person, is my response to that. I brought a lot of swatches to my classes and would show them, this is a cotton linen, that's what this feels like. It has a thread count in the weft of this and a warp. So I taught that, and they actually would go and take a weaving class or a knitting class, or there were hands-on classes offered that way. And that was the education I got. I did a lot of weaving in college. And in fact, I dyed my own, I bought fleece, sheared sheep fleece, and I washed it. And then I would spin my own yarn. And for the weaving, I would spin my own yarn and I would dye it. And then I would weave it. So I did everything. And that's how I learned a lot, just by hands-on doing it. And I think unless someone has an understanding or can go visit a factory and see what's going on, you can go to a fabric store and go look at the fabrics and see what the fiber content is and what's the weave like. And you can get the same thing from books. You can't see, but I've got so many books here on textiles and weaving, and I have a large library that I refer to. And I have books on textile design and embroidery design from many countries. And that's where I get a lot of inspiration from that.
Tell me a little bit about your journey. How did you decide, or what inspired you to come to the textile design part of it? Was it something that you knew as a career path, or you just discovered along the
No, I had no idea. I wanted to go to, there were some great art schools in Los Angeles where I grew up, and I wanted to go to an art college. And I come from an extremely academic family, and they didn't want to send me to that kind of a school. They wanted me to get a well-rounded education, which I hardly needed later on. But I was really interested in studying art. And then when I got to college, as I said, I started taking textile classes. I started doing a lot of experiment. That's one way you learn. And I
But at
started,
that time, you didn't know that textile as a career path.
I didn't know that was what I wanted to do. I really
Mhm.
didn't. I was looking for something that would inspire me, but I knew what I didn't want to do. I want to sit in an office all day and be bored. I wanted to do something creative. I have a vast amount of creative energy that I wanted to put to use. And so by joining the art department and taking a lot of classes in the art department, all these varied classes, I learned how to print textiles, hand print, block prints, kind of block prints like they do in Rajasthan. And I would make my own blocks and then stamp them. So I taught my students a lot of different printing techniques and had them do it themselves. So I would give them assignments like to create a collection. First, they had to come up with a color palette. Then they had to come up with textile ideas, constantly a print ideas or embroidery ideas or whatever. And then they had to show the swatches of what they saw they would be putting it on. So that they were thinking about color, they were thinking about fabric, and they were thinking about but I learned my very first job. I worked for a company called Santa Cruz Imports, which was in the town of Santa Cruz. And that was a very interesting experience. I was in my early 20s, and the owner of the company hired me to do a very low level job in terms of sales. And I'm not a salesperson.
Mhm.
And I didn't want to do that job anymore. So I kept going and pestering him. And that's one thing I would say. If
Mhm.
somebody is interested in getting into a company, you have to be very confident about your abilities, and you have to learn to have a thick skin. And if they say no, then keep going,
Mhm.
because not everybody comes out of school with experience. How do you get
Yeah.
experience? You get experience by getting hired.
Mm.
So anyway, but that's an interesting story because I kept going, and I brought in at that time, there weren't computer portfolios. Now that's what people have, is computer portfolios. But I brought in all the textiles I did in college, and they made an appointment with the owner of the company, and I dragged out all this stuff, and I said, see, I want to do this. I know I can do it. And
Mhm.
here's this and here's that. And he's like, wow, I didn't know you could do all that.
Mhm.
And I said, I would love an opportunity to be able to design textiles. I would be so thrilled. And he said, okay, let me think about it. We don't have any textile designers, because he
Mhm.
would go to India by himself and just buy market fabric
Oh, okay.
and then create garments from that.
Mhm.
So they hired me, and they hired Tommy Hilfiger. You
Mhm.
know who
Yes,
Hilfiger
of
is?
course. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Definitely.
So I didn't work with him on his line. He had a separate line,
Uh-huh.
and he eventually got fired because his line didn't sell. And then he
Mhm.
went back to New York and started his own company, and the rest is history. I worked for them for several years in Santa Cruz and created lots of lines for them, and everything was selling really well. And so
Mhm.
then they were moving the company to San Francisco. And at
Mhm.
that point, it became Esprit's competitor, not as large as Esprit, but on that level of the product that they did. And it was a very popular company.
Mhm.
And they offered me to move. They would pay for me to relocate up to San Francisco if I wanted to continue to work for them. So that's what I did, because what else was going on? Nothing else was going on at that point in time.
Mhm.
So that's how I got started. And then that company, it was owned by a husband and wife, and eventually they got a divorce and they sold the company. So, and I moved on to work for other companies and eventually landed at Esprit. And then from there, I landed at Pottery Barn. So
Mhm.
you just have to, that's what you do, but you have to have anybody that wants to go into textile design has to be prepared to hear no a lot. It's kind of like becoming an actress, you know? So
Yeah.
don't get discouraged. You just have to keep going.
Today's atmosphere, so much everything computerized. What are some of the skills that one needs to develop if somebody is interested in textile design? Um, what are the career paths? Let's talk about that first. Like, what are the career
Okay.
paths that
Well,
exists today?
so the career path really depends on the area of expertise that the person had, what their expertise is and what their
Hmm.
experience is. But
Hmm.
generally, people start out as an unpaid intern.
Hmm.
So that's working for free. And if somebody can afford to do, that's one way to get a foot in the door. From an intern, and then if you were good enough, you would go on to be an assistant designer
Hmm.
and hopefully work with somebody that can teach you something. And then from assistant designer, you go to be a designer, just the
Hmm.
title designer. And then from there, you go to be a senior designer slash art director. And then from there, you go to be director of the division. And then from there, you go to be vice president of the division. And from there, you go to be the president of the company. It takes a long time to get along the path. It's not an instantaneous thing, but I have seen mostly women,
Hmm.
young women come in to want to do that job. I've
Hmm.
seen some that are really talented move along faster.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think having confidence and having talent are the two starting points.
Hmm.
And as far as working on the computer goes, to know the programs that are used most often,
Hmm.
which are generally Photoshop and Illustrator.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
now I'm sure it's something else. I haven't been at Pottery Barn for a while, but they were always up on the latest and the greatest. So I know a lot about photography apps. But as far as being able to walk in and do a job, I don't think anyone expects somebody straight out of school to be able to do that necessarily. You usually end up having some real low level job. That's what I did. And then you just persevere.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it requires people skills. You have to be able to be diplomatic.
Mm-hmm.
Even when people are really awful, you have to just be calm and make your point without being aggressive. A desire
Mm-hmm.
to learn and listen. I've had some people young people come in straight out of college and they think they know everything. And they're very opinionated about that. So that's not always a good approach. I think it requires enthusiasm and ability to listen and learn.
Mm-hmm.
Congeniality is important. You have to get along with the people that you work with in a studio. You're constantly coordinating with others in the studio. A lot of projects start with one person and get handed off to the next person and the next person, whoever has the best skill in whatever is required. So you can't really function very well in a studio like that.
Are there any specific regions that have more jobs in this area?
Yes, absolutely. New York is a big one. New York is a real center design for garments, particularly, and a lot of the textile studios are studio. And by studio, I mean something different than what I'm talking about working in a studio at Pottery Barn or whatever. Studios are commercial studios that have collectives of artists
Mm-hmm.
that they every season call designs from them. They'll come in and present their designs and they'll say, okay, I'll take this one, I'll take this one, I'll take this one. I don't want these. And then they travel. They have traveling sales reps who go around and show their artworks, go
Okay.
around and show these art to a swimsuit company or a dress company or whatever. They'll take the prints, they'll decide what's going to appeal to that particular person that they're trying to sell them to or company that they're trying to sell them to. And I used to schedule a lot of appointments at Esprit and at Pottery Barn. And it's actually really fun. I got to see a lot of work that was being done and I got to know a lot of people. And I would see them in New York. I would see them at the trade shows. And so that's one way to network. It's a good way to network. So those studios will hire, they don't have to be so experienced. They can be an expert textile painter.
Regarding the education today, like you said, specific form of degree doesn't matter. What would be the process? Like if somebody is like very artistic, can they get into the industry and what do they need to do to be able to do that?
Well, I would say the most important thing is to have a very professional looking portfolio. And how you get that is by doing a lot of designs and don't just show everything you've ever done in the last 5 years. Be really critical about what you're showing. Only show your best work. And if you can impress someone with your skill set that way, then you may get some freelance work from it. And if you get freelance work and you start working at a company as a freelancer, you're in and out. You're not 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. You're there. They call you when they need you. I had a list of freelancers that I would run through when I had too much work and not enough people to do it. And I knew which ones do what. I think that it's important that to be a freelancer and to be in that environment, to be an intern, if you can get in, like I said before, if you can afford to do that, a lot of people can't afford to do that these days. But if you can get in as an intern, you won't probably be designing. They'll probably have you filing swatches or something at first. It will be somewhat menial at first, but you work your way up just like any other industry. And personally, I don't think it's important to have a master's degree or anything else. I mean, I feel like I have a master's degree in experience. So I think it's more in the experience and getting the actual experience. And like I said, if you can get into trade shows, going to trade shows, Sometimes you can't. You have to have like a business card and be a legitimate person to get into some of the trade shows, especially in Europe.
Mm.
But here, sometimes they would have shows at the Moscone Center, which isn't very active anymore. But I think if you really want to get a job in the industry, New York or LA are the places to be,
Mhm. Mhm.
especially in New York.
Even though master's degree is not needed, like a bachelor's degree, would you say in today's time, one needs to go and get a textile design or any bachelor's degree would do?
I think it's not even really necessary to have a bachelor's degree
Hmm.
at this point. I
Okay.
think if you have practical experience, go to college, go to Academy of Art College, go to CCA, and
Mm.
take textile design classes and create a portfolio. And I think that's
Mm.
what you need now. I don't think degrees are as important as they would be in some much more technical kind of job or like being a doctor. Or for this, you need to just have a really good eye and a really good color sense and a knowledge that you
Mm.
acquire probably on your own, reading a lot. There are libraries full of books. That's what I did at first. I took the classes, but I read everything I could get my hands on about textile printing and about knitting and about weaving. And there are very few schools that have textile programs. There are a couple on the East Coast. There's Rhode Island School of Design in the state of Rhode Island that a lot of people come out of. That I've seen some wonderful designers come out of Rhode Island School of Design. There's also Syracuse in upstate New York is another one. Even UC Davis used
Mm.
to have, I don't know if it's still as good as it was, but they used to have a really excellent textile department.
Mm.
So I'm not sure what the state of it is right now because I don't know anybody that's there anymore as in the way of professors. But yeah, that's what I think. And in LA, there's FIDM, which is Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure how good their textile classes are. That's mostly set up for merchandising, which is a
Mm.
whole different
Mm.
thing. That's for buyers
Mm.
and people that want to work in stores and create a department in a store.
What are some of the resources would you recommend? Maybe it is books that inspired you, or any websites or anything like that really helps, that you think would be helpful for students who are interested in this line.
Well, there are design libraries in New York, and one's
Mm.
called the Design Library that have so many swatches, most of them vintage. And the advantage to that is that you can look at a lot of stuff at one time.
Mhm.
There's also in New York, Cotton Incorporated, which
Mm.
generally has all cotton, but they always display fabrics and what the content is and what the weave is and all that. So you can educate yourself that way. That's a resource. In San Francisco, honestly, there's very little in the way of those kind of resources, mostly LA or New York.
Mm.
The design libraries in LA or New York and study different types of woven, knitted, and printed textiles. Read a lot of books and look for the other thing is a lot of it has to do with inspiration. So looking for inspiration in nature,
Mhm.
museums, looking at other cultures, going to art galleries, and just get inspired about color and form and composition and all that kind of stuff. Going to trade shows if you can get in. And the one thing I would advise anybody that's trying to get a foot in the door is to make as many contacts in college, after college as possible.
Mhm.
You just have to kind of introduce yourself to people, maybe get some business cards made and so you look legit
Mhm.
and then start talking to people.
Mhm.
See if you can get in to see different vendors or different fabric printers. Otherwise, you can try to get into trade shows and students at CCA. I know this from having taught there. Every year when the seniors graduate, they have a senior fashion show
Mhm.
where some students create the textiles, they work in pairs. Students create the textiles, the knits, the whatever, and then other students create the garments, just like in the real world. And then they have this fashion show, and the students, after the fashion show's over, they all go into this big room, and the students all have their portfolios. These are physical portfolios, and people go around and talk to them, look at their work because they just saw their work in the fashion show, and they'll go and talk to the graduating students. And a lot of students got hired that way. I just say network, and teachers are a good resource too. There are new fields that are coming up, and sustainability has been around for quite a while. And other students talk to other students. Some of my students got hired by big time designers in New York.
That's really very helpful information. Thank you so much for joining me
Oh,
and
you're
sharing.
welcome. My pleasure. Thank
Sharing
you.
a lot of information about this field, which I think generally is not available otherwise, unless you
I'm
really.
pretty enthusiastic about it, as you can. So I love to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to, if you come across somebody that is interested in the field and wants to talk to somebody about it, I'm open to that possibility. It depends how busy I am at the time, but yeah. So anyway, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
That's it for today's episode of Career Calling. I hope you found it helpful. I'll be back soon with more stories of professions from all walks of life to help you find your calling. Until then, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word.